The condemned Victorian mansion at 1247 Maple Street had been rotting for 40 years when Yen first saw the auction listing. $256 for a house that most people wouldn't enter without a hazmat suit. But Yen wasn't most people. Behind her pregnant belly and gentle smile lay the sharp mind of a restoration architect who had spent 15 years breathing life back into forgotten buildings. What she didn't expect was finding the hidden room behind the kitchen wall or the leather-bound journal inside that detailed her great-grandmother's mysterious disappearance in 1924. As Yen peeled back layers of wallpaper and decades of neglect, she uncovered something far more valuable than the original hardwood floors, a family secret that powerful people had killed to keep buried. Now, 6 months pregnant and racing against time, she must finish the restoration before they realize what she's found. But every renovation reveals another clue, and every clue brings her closer to a truth that could destroy her family or set them free forever. What was her great-grandmother hiding that was worth a lifetime of silence? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, Yen had stood on the cracked sidewalk outside 1247 Maple Street, her architect's eye seeing past the broken windows and sagging porch to the bones of what had once been magnificent. The October wind whipped through her dark hair as she circled the property, noting the solid foundation and the ornate gingerbread trim that somehow survived 4 decades of abandonment. Her husband Marcus thought she'd lost her mind. "We're having a baby in 3 months," he'd said that morning over breakfast, gesturing at her rounded belly. "This is not the time to take on a project that could literally kill us from mold exposure." But Yen had already run the numbers. Even with extensive renovations, the house would be worth 10 times what she'd paid. More importantly, something about the listing had tugged at her memory. The address felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain. The auction was held on the courthouse steps on a grey Thursday morning. Yen was the only bidder present who wasn't representing a demolition company. When her paddle won at $256, the auctioneer looked genuinely surprised that anyone wanted to preserve the structure. Walking through the front door that first day required a face mask and steel-toed boots. Water damage had warped the hardwood floors into rolling hills. Black mold crept up the wallpapered walls like spreading ink. The staircase groaned ominously with each step, and several windows were boarded up from the inside, casting everything in perpetual twilight. But Yen could see the craftsmanship beneath the decay. The crown molding was hand-carved, the banister made from solid walnut. Someone had built this house to last forever, and despite 4 decades of neglect, it was still standing. She started with the kitchen, both because it was the most structurally sound room and because she needed somewhere to set up her temporary office. While stripping away layers of peeling linoleum, she discovered original ceramic tiles underneath, each one hand-painted with tiny blue flowers. It was while removing a section of damaged drywall behind the sink that she noticed something odd. Her measuring tape showed the kitchen was 3 feet shorter than it should be, according to the original blueprints she'd found at the county clerk's office. She tapped along the wall, listening for the hollow sound that would indicate empty space behind. The sound changed near the corner, definitely hollow. Using a reciprocating saw, she carefully cut through the drywall. Behind it was another wall, this one made of the original plaster and lathe construction. And behind that, when she finally broke through, was a small room that shouldn't exist. The hidden space was perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet, with no windows and no other entrance. The air inside was stale but surprisingly dry. A small wooden table sat in the center, and on it, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a leather journal. Yen's hands trembled as she opened the journal. The first page, written in fading blue ink, made her heart stop. Property of Elena Castellanos, 1924. Castellanos was Yen's maiden name. Her great-grandmother Elena had disappeared when Yen's grandmother was just 12 years old. Family legend said she'd run off with a traveling salesman, abandoning her daughter and never returning. But here was Elena's journal, hidden in the walls of a house nobody knew she'd ever owned. The entries began normally enough. Daily observations about the weather, notes about household expenses. But as Yen read deeper, a more disturbing picture emerged. Elena wrote about being followed, about men in expensive suits asking questions around town, about discovering something she shouldn't have, and the growing certainty that her life was in danger. The final entry was dated November 15th, 1924, the day Elena disappeared. They know what I found. I've hidden the evidence where only family will think to look. If something happens to me, I pray someday Maria's children will understand why I had to choose between truth and safety. The mill records tell the real story. Remember, the foundation stones know their secrets. Outside, a car door slammed. Yen quickly closed the journal, her mind racing. Who was Elena hiding from? What mill records? And why did Yen suddenly feel like she was being watched? The rusty key turned with surprising ease, as if the house had been waiting for her arrival. Yen pushed open the heavy oak door, wincing as it groaned on ancient hinges. The smell hit her immediately, not the musty decay she'd expected, but something else entirely. Cedar and lavender, with an underlying sweetness that reminded her of her grandmother's perfume. "That's impossible," she whispered, one hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly. The house had been abandoned for decades according to the city records. There shouldn't be any pleasant scents lingering here. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light streaming through grimy windows as Yen stepped across the threshold. The hardwood floors, though dulled by neglect, showed no signs of rot or warping. If anything, they seemed to gleam with potential beneath their coating of grime. Her phone buzzed. "Marcus again. Are you seriously at that death trap right now?" His voice crackled through the speaker when she answered. "It's not a death trap. It's actually quite—" She paused, studying the intricate crown molding that ran along the ceiling. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, far beyond what she'd glimpsed from the street. "Marcus, the architectural details here are incredible. This could be a significant restoration project." "Yen, honey, you're 6 months pregnant, and we just bought a house for the price of a decent laptop. Doesn't that strike you as concerning?" She understood his worry. Truly she did. But standing in this front parlor, surrounded by original plasterwork and hand-carved wooden details, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Not just professional excitement, but a strange sense of homecoming. "I'll be careful," she promised, ending the call before he could protest further. The main floor revealed room after room of surprising preservation. The kitchen still housed a massive cast-iron stove, and though the copper pipes would need replacing, the bones of the house were remarkably sound. Each room told a story through its design choices, from the breakfast nook's built-in banquette to the library's floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves. It was in the library that she found the first photograph. Tucked behind a loose piece of wainscoting, the sepia-toned image showed a woman standing in what was unmistakably this very room. But the woman's face made Yen's breath catch. The resemblance was uncanny. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn chin, even the same wayward curl that refused to stay pinned back. She flipped the photograph over. In faded ink, someone had written, "Evangeline Thorne, 1924. "Thorne," Yen repeated aloud. Her maiden name was Thornton, but her grandmother had always insisted the family name had been altered when they emigrated. Could this woman be a relative? The physical similarity was too striking to dismiss as coincidence. A sound from upstairs made her freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Her rational mind immediately offered explanations. Settling wood, thermal expansion, old houses making old house noises. But these sounded distinctly like someone walking across floorboards above her head. "Hello?" she called out, feeling somewhat foolish. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. Yen climbed the curved staircase, one hand trailing along the polished banister. The second-floor hallway stretched before her, lined with doors, All were closed except one at the far end, which stood slightly ajar. The baby chose that moment to kick, a sharp reminder of her condition. Marcus was right. What was she doing exploring an abandoned house alone while pregnant? But something drew her forward, toward that partially open door. The room beyond was clearly the master bedroom, dominated by an enormous four-poster bed draped in dusty burgundy velvet. But it wasn't the furniture that captured her attention. It was the portrait hanging above the fireplace. Evangeline Thorne gazed down at her from the ornate frame, but this painting showed her in full color. The woman wore a deep blue gown that perfectly matched the shade of Yen's own eyes, and around her neck hung a distinctive pendant, a silver tree with intricate roots that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. More unsettling than the resemblance, though, was the woman's expression. Evangeline appeared to be looking directly at Yen, as if she'd been waiting decades for this moment of recognition. A manila envelope sat propped against the portrait's frame, as if recently placed there. Yen's name was written across it in flowing script. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a deed, not to this house, but to a property in Scotland dated 1847. The original owner's name was listed as Moira Thornton. Below the deed, a single line was written in the same elegant handwriting: "Some inheritance transcends death. The roots call you home." Outside, storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, and Yen realized the afternoon light was fading far too quickly, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Not yet. Not when she was finally beginning to understand that her $256 purchase had been anything but random. The house had been waiting for her return. The key felt heavier than it should have as Yen turned it in the rusted lock. The door groaned open, releasing a musty breath that spoke of decades in darkness. She stepped across the threshold, one hand instinctively resting on her growing belly, the other clutching her phone's flashlight. The realtor had warned her about the electricity being shut off years ago, but nothing had prepared her for the oppressive weight of the house's silence. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light, filtering through boarded windows, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that made her feel like an intruder in a forgotten world. Her footsteps echoed on warped hardwood floors as she moved through what had once been a grand foyer. Despite the decay, she could see the bones of something magnificent, crown molding that spoke of skilled craftsmanship, a sweeping staircase with hand-carved balusters, and doorways framed with intricate woodwork that no modern home could replicate. "Okay, baby," she whispered to her unborn child. "Let's see what $256 bought us." The living room opened before her like a time capsule. Furniture draped in white sheets created ghostly silhouettes, and when she pulled away one covering, she gasped. Underneath sat a pristine Victorian sofa, its burgundy velvet unmarred by time. How had it survived so perfectly while everything else showed signs of neglect? Her architect's eye began cataloguing possibilities: load-bearing walls, sightlines, natural light sources. The layout was unusual, with rooms flowing into each other in an organic pattern that seemed almost intentional, as if the house had grown rather than been built. She pulled out her tablet and began sketching, muscle memory taking over as she documented measurements and structural details. It was while measuring the kitchen that she found the first anomaly. According to her calculations, there should be at least 8 feet of space between the kitchen wall and the exterior of the house, but the room ended abruptly. She rapped her knuckles against the wall, hollow sound, definitely hiding something. Running her hands along the painted surface, she discovered what felt like the outline of a door, painted over so many times it had nearly disappeared. The original hardware was gone, but there was a small depression where a handle once sat. When she pressed against it, the hidden door swung inward with surprising ease. Cool air rushed out, carrying scents of cedar and something else, something floral and faint like perfume that had lingered far past its time. Her phone's light revealed a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Every rational instinct told her to wait, to come back with Marcus and proper equipment, but curiosity, the same drive that had led her to architecture, to seeing potential where others saw only problems, pulled her forward. The wooden steps were solid beneath her feet, clearly built to last. As she descended, the walls changed from painted plaster to natural stone, and she realized this part of the house was much older than what she'd seen above. The craftsmanship was different too, more primitive but somehow more authentic. At the bottom, her light revealed a small room that took her breath away. Unlike the musty neglect upstairs, this space felt alive. Shelves lined the walls, filled with glass jars containing dried herbs and flowers. A heavy wooden table dominated the center, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. And everywhere, carved into the stone walls, were symbols she didn't recognize, spirals and interconnected circles that seemed to shift in the moving light. On the table lay an open book, its pages yellowed but readable. Yen approached carefully, aware that she was looking at something that predated the house above by decades, maybe longer. The handwriting was feminine, elegant, and as her light settled on the page, she could make out individual words. The child born under the harvest moon will carry the gift forward, and 3 generations must pass before the power can be reclaimed. Her baby chose that moment to kick, a sharp movement that made her gasp and step backward. As she did, her light swept across something that made her heart stop, a portrait hanging in a simple frame, depicting a woman who could have been her twin. Same dark hair, same angular features, same determined set to her jaw. The only difference was the woman's clothing, a simple dress that belonged to another century. Below the portrait, a brass nameplate read, Elena Ashworth, 1847 to 1923. Yen's hands shook as she photographed the portrait, the book, the carved symbols. The resemblance was impossible to ignore, but what disturbed her more was the book's focus on children and generations. How could century-old writings seem to anticipate her arrival? Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "How's our investment looking?" She stared at the message, then at the impossible room around her. How could she explain that their $256 gamble had led her to what felt like destiny, that she'd found traces of a woman who shared her face in a hidden room that predated recorded ownership of the property? Instead, she typed back, complicated. "We need to talk tonight." The morning light filtering through the grimy windows revealed details Yen hadn't noticed in yesterday's dim exploration. She stood in what had once been the main parlor, her architect's eye cataloguing the intricate crown molding and the way the natural light played across the hardwood floors beneath layers of dust and debris. Her hand unconsciously rested on her belly as she moved through the space. At 16 weeks, the pregnancy was starting to show, and Marcus had insisted she wear steel-toed boots and carry her phone at all times during these solo visits to the house. She'd promised to be careful, but something about this place called to her in a way she couldn't explain to him or to herself. The floorboards creaked as she made her way toward the staircase. Each step seemed to echo with whispers of the past, and she found herself wondering about the families who had lived here, who had walked these same halls. The house felt heavy with stories, and as an architect, she understood that buildings held memories in their bones. She pulled out her tablet and began sketching rough measurements and notes. The structural integrity seemed surprisingly sound for a condemned building. The foundation was solid stone, and despite the cosmetic damage, the bones of the house were strong. She could envision opening up the kitchen to create better flow, adding modern fixtures while preserving the historical character that made the place unique. A sound from upstairs made her freeze. It was subtle, like footsteps, but softer. Probably mice, she told herself, though her pulse quickened. Old houses were full of sounds, settling and shifting with temperature changes and the passage of time. She called out anyway just to be sure. "Hello? Is someone there?" Only silence answered, but she decided to investigate. The staircase was more ornate than she'd initially realized, with carved banister posts that spoke of craftsmanship from another era. As she climbed, she noticed something odd about the wall along the stairs. The wallpaper was peeling in strategic places, revealing what looked like deliberate markings underneath. On the second floor, she found 4 bedrooms and a bathroom that would need complete renovation. The master bedroom faced east, and she could imagine waking up to sunrise streaming through clean windows instead of the current grime-covered panes. This could be the nursery, she thought, placing her hand over her growing bump. The baby could grow up in a house with history, with character, instead of one of the cookie-cutter developments they'd been considering. But it was the smallest bedroom that captured her attention. Unlike the others, this room felt different, colder somehow, despite receiving the same amount of natural light. The wallpaper here was completely stripped away, revealing bare plaster walls covered in what appeared to be pencil markings. She moved closer, squinting in the dim light. The markings weren't random. They were deliberate, methodical, dates, names, and symbols that formed a pattern she couldn't quite decipher. Some of the dates went back over a century, and the handwriting varied, suggesting multiple people had contributed to whatever record this was. She took photos with her tablet, making sure to capture the details clearly. Among the names, one stood out: Eleanor Hartwell, 1923. Below it, in the same careful script, were the words "the 7th generation" and a symbol that looked like intertwined circles. Yen traced the marking with her finger, feeling an odd tingling sensation at the contact. A door slammed somewhere in the house. She froze, listening intently. The sound had come from downstairs, definitely not the settling of old wood or the scurrying of rodents. Someone else was in the house. "Hello?" she called again, louder this time. "I'm the new owner. I have a right to be here." Footsteps echoed from below, deliberate, human footsteps moving through the rooms she'd just explored. Her heart hammered as she considered her options. The stairs were the only way down, which meant confronting whoever was down there. She pulled out her phone, relieved to see she had signal, and typed a quick text to Marcus at the house. "Think someone else is here. Will call if I need help." She moved carefully toward the stairs, tablet clutched in one hand, phone in the other. The footsteps had stopped, but she could sense a presence below, waiting. As she descended, each creak of the old wood seemed amplified in the sudden silence. Reaching the main floor, she peered around the corner into the parlor, empty. But the front door, which she was certain she'd closed and locked behind her, stood slightly ajar. A piece of paper was tucked into the doorframe, white against the dark wood. With trembling fingers, she pulled it free and unfolded it. The message was brief, written in the same careful script she'd seen upstairs. "Some houses choose their owners. Welcome home, Eleanor." The name hit her like a physical blow. Eleanor had been her grandmother's name. Her grandmother who had died when Yen was just a child and who had always insisted their family had deep roots in this town that went back generations. The basement stairs creaked under Yen's weight as she descended into the bowels of the house, her phone's flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. The air grew thicker with each step, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic that made her stomach churn. She paused halfway down, one hand instinctively moving to her growing belly. "Just old pipes," she whispered to herself, though the words felt hollow in the suffocating space. The basement stretched further than she'd expected, extending well beyond the house's footprint above. Her light swept across stone walls that gleamed with moisture, revealing scratches in the mortar that looked almost deliberate. As she moved deeper into the space, her foot struck something that skittered across the floor with a metallic ring. Yen crouched carefully, her beam illuminating a tarnished brass key, ornate and heavy in her palm. The metal felt warm despite the basement's chill, and intricate symbols were etched along its length, symbols that seemed to shift in the dancing light. She'd never seen anything like them, yet something about their curves and angles felt familiar, like a half-remembered dream. A soft thud from somewhere in the darkness made her freeze. The sound came again, rhythmic and purposeful, like footsteps on packed earth. But that was impossible. She was alone in the house. She'd locked the door behind her. "Hello?" Her voice cracked slightly. The footsteps stopped. Yen forced herself to move forward, following the stone wall with her free hand. Her fingers traced along the rough surface until they found what felt like a seam. She pressed against it, and a section of the wall shifted inward with a grinding sound that seemed to echo through her bones. Beyond the hidden door lay a narrow corridor that stretched into absolute blackness. The air that flowed from within carried a different quality, older, heavier, tinged with the scent of aged parchment and candle wax. Against every rational thought screaming in her head, she stepped inside. The corridor opened into a circular chamber carved directly from bedrock. Yen's light revealed shelves carved into the walls, lined with leather-bound volumes and glass jars filled with substances she couldn't identify. In the center of the room stood a wooden table, its surface covered with papers and what appeared to be architectural drawings. She approached the table with trembling hands. The papers were old but remarkably preserved, covered in the same flowing script she'd seen in the journal upstairs. But it was the drawings that made her breath catch. They were blueprints, detailed plans for the house above, but not as it currently stood. These showed additional rooms, hidden passages, and a complex network of underground chambers that extended far beyond what she'd discovered. At the bottom of one drawing, in faded ink, she read, "For the heir who comes after, may they prove worthy of the legacy." A notation in the margin caught her eye. The transformation requires willing sacrifice. The bloodline must choose. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had added, "Sarah chose poorly. The price was too high." Yen's hands shook as she rifled through more papers. Birth certificates, death records, property deeds, all bearing the name Blackwood, spanning over 2 centuries. And there, near the bottom of the pile, she found her grandmother's birth certificate. The mother's name was listed as Elena Blackwood. The phone slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering to the stone floor and plunging the chamber into darkness. In the absolute black, she heard something that made her blood freeze, the soft whisper of pages turning, though she was alone in the room. A dim light began to emanate from the walls themselves, revealing symbols carved into the stone that pulsed with a soft blue radiance. The light was beautiful and terrible, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with purpose. The brass key in her hand grew warm, then hot, the symbols along its length beginning to glow with the same ethereal light. Footsteps echoed from the corridor behind her, slow and measured. Someone, or something, was approaching. Yen scrambled for her phone, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied now by the rustle of fabric and a sound like breathing, though it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if responding to some unseen presence. Yen pressed her back against the table, the papers crinkling beneath her weight. The glowing symbols on the walls pulsed faster now, their light revealing more details of the chamber, symbols that covered every surface, creating patterns that seemed to spiral inward toward the center where she stood. A shadow moved in the corridor entrance, tall and fluid, neither fully human nor entirely other. As it stepped into the chamber, the temperature plummeted, and Yen's breath came out in visible puffs. The figure raised what might have been a hand, pointing directly at her swollen belly. When it spoke, its voice was layered with harmonics that seemed to come from the stone itself. The heir returns at last. The transformation awaits. The morning light filtering through the cracked windows revealed what Yen had missed in yesterday's shadows. The journal pages weren't just aged, they were organized with meticulous care, each entry dated and cross-referenced with small sketches in the margins. Elena Blackwood hadn't been rambling, she'd been documenting something methodically. Yen settled into the window seat, her back against the cool glass, and opened to a page dated September 15th, 1924. The handwriting was steady here, confident. The transformation begins with understanding. What others call magic, I know to be architecture of a different sort. The blueprints written in blood and bone rather than ink and paper. The house chooses its inheritor not through deed or purchase, but through recognition of potential. A chill ran down Yen's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. She touched her belly instinctively, feeling the subtle flutter that had become her constant companion. Each generation, the vessel must be prepared. The child must be born within these walls when the autumn moon reaches its apex. Only then can the legacy transfer completely, safely. To attempt otherwise risks losing everything, the gifts, the knowledge, the very essence of what we are. Yen's hands trembled slightly as she turned the page. More sketches appeared, architectural drawings, but unlike any she'd seen in her years of study, these showed rooms that seemed to exist in impossible spaces, staircases that curved through dimensions her trained eye couldn't quite follow. The sound of a car door slamming made her look up. Through the grimy window, she saw Marcus climbing out of his sedan, his expression grim. Behind him, a second car pulled up, her sister Carmen's hybrid. "Damn," Yen muttered, carefully closing the journal and tucking it behind a loose floorboard. She'd specifically asked them not to come today. She made her way downstairs, noting how the house seemed to settle around her movement, as if adjusting to her presence. The front door opened before she could reach it. "Yen, thank God," Carmen rushed in, her designer heels clicking against the warped floorboards. "When you didn't answer your phone this morning, we thought—" "I'm fine," Yen interrupted, though she realized she hadn't even thought to check her phone since arriving. "Just focused on work." Marcus stepped through the doorway more cautiously, his contractor's eye immediately cataloguing the building's problems. "This place is worse than I thought. The foundation alone has been standing for over a century," Yen finished. "It's not going anywhere." "Yen." Carmen's voice carried that particular tone she'd used since childhood when she thought her younger sister was being unreasonable. "Look at yourself. Really look." For the first time, Yen glanced down at her clothes. Her jeans were dusty, her sweater had several snags, and her hands were grimy with old wood stain and dust. More concerning was the realization that she felt more energized than she had in weeks, despite having spent the night in an unheated house with minimal amenities. "I've been working," she said defensively. "This is what renovation looks like." "Is it?" Marcus pulled out his phone, showing her the timestamp on his last text to her. "Because according to this, you've been working for 16 hours straight without a break. When's the last time you ate something?" The question stopped her short. She couldn't remember. Not just when she'd last eaten, but whether she'd felt hungry at all since entering the house yesterday afternoon. That wasn't normal, especially given how her pregnancy had made her constantly aware of her body's needs. Carmen was studying her face with growing concern. "Your eyes look different, brighter, but intense. And your skin—" She reached out to touch Yen's cheek, then pulled back with a startled expression. "You're warm, really warm." "It's October, Carmen. Of course I'm warm. I've been moving around." But even as she said it, Yen noticed that neither of her companions had removed their jackets, and she could see their breath in the chilled air. She couldn't see her own. Marcus moved deeper into the room, his flashlight beam catching the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny living things. "The electrical system here is completely shot. How have you been seeing anything?" "The natural light is better than you'd think," Yen replied, though as she said it, she realized the rooms did seem clearer to her than they should have, even in the dim morning light filtering through dirty windows. "Yen," Carmen's voice was gentler now, worried rather than bossy. "I think you should come home with us, just for today. Get a proper meal, a shower, some rest in an actual bed." "I'm pregnant, not sick," Yen protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Something was different, had been different since she'd first crossed the threshold. The question was whether that difference was something to embrace or fear. The house creaked around them, a sound like settling wood that somehow felt more like breathing. Both Carmen and Marcus looked up nervously, but Yen found the sound comforting, almost like a lullaby. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the house as Yen pried open the last floorboard in what had once been a nursery. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, filtering through grimy windows, and she paused to wipe sweat from her forehead with the back of her gloved hand. At 7 months pregnant, every movement required careful consideration, but her determination had only grown stronger since finding the photograph hidden behind the loose wallpaper 3 days ago. The image still haunted her, a woman who could have been her twin standing in front of this very house when it was new and gleaming. On the back, someone had written, Elena Vasquez, 1923, in fading ink. Yen had spent sleepless nights staring at that photograph, searching for differences between herself and this mysterious ancestor she'd never known existed. The phone buzzed against her hip. Marcus again. She'd been avoiding his calls since their argument about the house renovations. He thought she was pushing herself too hard, that her obsession with uncovering the house's history was becoming unhealthy. But he didn't understand the pull she felt, the way the house seemed to whisper her name in the quiet moments between day and night. The floorboard came free with a groan, revealing a space beneath that made her heart race. Unlike the other hiding spots she'd discovered, this one contained something substantial, a leather-bound journal wrapped in oiled cloth. Her hands trembled as she lifted it carefully, mindful of its obvious age. The leather was soft with decades of handling, the brass clasp tarnished but still functional. When she opened it, the scent of old roses and something else, something medicinal, wafted up from the yellowed pages. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, as if the writer had been racing against time. October 15th, 1923, the first entry began. The house remembers everything. I can feel it in the walls, in the very foundation stones. What we thought was a blessing has become something else entirely. The children, God help me, the children are changing. Yen's breath caught. She lowered herself carefully to sit cross-legged on the floor, the journal cradled in her lap. Her baby shifted restlessly, as if sensing her agitation, and she placed a protective hand over her swollen belly. The entries continued, each one more disturbing than the last. Elena wrote of strange occurrences, toys moving by themselves, whispers in empty rooms, and children who aged too slowly or too quickly. But it was the entry, dated November 3rd, that made Yen's blood run cold. Found the source today, beneath the foundation where the previous owners said nothing existed. A chamber carved from living rock, with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The real estate man lied. This house wasn't built on empty land. It was built on something much older, something that should have stayed buried. A creak from downstairs made Yen freeze. She listened intently, but the house had fallen silent again. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The sensation had been growing stronger each day, particularly when she was alone with her discoveries. She turned the page and found a hand-drawn map of the house's layout, but with additional rooms and passages marked in red ink. According to Elena's notations, there were spaces within the walls that shouldn't exist, hidden chambers that connected to something beneath the basement floor. In the margin, she'd written, "The house feeds on potential, on what could be. It's strongest around expectant mothers and young children." Yen's hand instinctively moved to her belly again. A chill ran down her spine as she remembered the real estate agent's nervous energy, the way he'd avoided her eyes when discussing the house's history. He'd claimed the previous owners had simply abandoned it, but Elena's journal painted a very different picture. The next entry was shorter, the handwriting more erratic. "We're leaving tonight. Carlos thinks I'm being hysterical, but he doesn't feel what I feel. The house is hungry, and it's been waiting. The others who lived here before us, they didn't abandon this place. They became part of it. I can hear them sometimes, calling from inside the walls." The final entry was dated 2 weeks later, but the handwriting was barely legible. "Too late. It's in my blood now, in the baby's blood. The house won't let us leave. But maybe I can leave warnings for the next one, for whoever comes after. The basement. Everything starts in the basement. Don't trust the foundation, don't trust the walls, and whatever you do, don't let it know you're carrying." The entry ended mid-sentence, the pen trailing off into an illegible scrawl. Yen sat in the growing twilight, the journal heavy in her hands. Outside, storm clouds were gathering, casting long shadows through the windows. She thought about Marcus, about the normal life she'd been building before this house called to her. But as her baby kicked restlessly against her ribs, she knew there was no going back. She had to find that basement chamber Elena had written about. She had to understand what she'd gotten herself into, and more importantly, how to protect her unborn child from whatever lived in the bones of this house. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows as Yen carefully descended the basement stairs, her hand trailing along the rough stone wall for support. The previous night's discovery of the hidden chamber had left her restless. Dreams filled with whispered voices and shadowy figures that seemed to beckon her deeper into the house's mysteries. Marcus had left early for a client meeting, expressing concern about her spending so much time in what he called that death trap. But Yen couldn't shake the feeling that the house was trying to tell her something important, something that connected to the strange sensations she'd been experiencing since moving in. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, studying the section of wall where she'd found the loose stones. In daylight, the opening was barely visible, just a hairline crack that might have been dismissed as natural settling. But when she pressed against the stones, they shifted with surprising ease, revealing the narrow passage beyond. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness as she squeezed through the opening, her pregnant belly making the passage tighter than before. The chamber beyond was smaller than she'd remembered, roughly 8 feet square with walls of fitted stone that predated the house above by decades, possibly centuries. But it wasn't the age of the construction that made her breath catch. It was what she saw carved into the far wall. Symbols she hadn't noticed in her previous brief exploration covered the stone surface, etched deep and filled with what looked like traces of old pigment. They weren't random scratches or decorative flourishes. These were deliberate, purposeful markings that seemed to follow some kind of pattern or language. Yen moved closer, running her fingers over the carved symbols. The stone was surprisingly warm to the touch, and she felt that familiar tingling sensation in her fingertips, the same feeling she'd experienced when touching certain walls throughout the house. As her hand traced the markings, images flashed through her mind, a woman in old-fashioned dress standing in this very chamber, hands pressed against these same symbols, lips moving in silent words. The vision was so vivid that Yen jerked her hand back, gasping. The chamber fell silent except for the sound of her own breathing and the distant creak of the house settling above. But the image lingered. The woman's face had been familiar, bearing a striking resemblance to Yen's own features, though her clothing suggested she lived over a century ago. A piece of paper rustled under Yen's foot, and she looked down to see a yellowed envelope that must have fallen from a crevice in the stones. Her name was written across it in faded ink, though the handwriting was clearly much older than her 28 years. With trembling fingers, she picked up the envelope and carefully opened it. The letter inside was written in the same aged hand. To the one who bears our blood and carries the future, you have found what was meant to be found. The symbols speak of protection, of gifts passed through the women of our line, of responsibilities that cannot be ignored. What you feel stirring within you is not just new life, but awakened power that has slept for 3 generations. The house chose you as surely as you chose it. Trust what you feel, trust what you see. But beware, others have sought what you now possess, and they will not hesitate to claim it by force if necessary. The letter was unsigned, but at the bottom was a small drawing that made Yen's blood run cold. It showed the same symbols from the wall arranged in a circle, and in the center, the outline of a pregnant woman with lines of energy radiating from her hands. A sound from above made her freeze, footsteps crossing the main floor, too heavy to be Marcus returning early. The front door creaked open, followed by muffled voices. Yen quickly folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket, then moved toward the passage opening. "Told you she comes down here," a man's voice was saying. "The readings are strongest in the basement." "Then we need to move fast," a woman replied. "She doesn't understand what she's dealing with, but if the bloodline is as strong as the records suggest, we're running out of time." Yen's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized these weren't casual visitors or even potential buyers. Somehow, these people knew about her, about what she'd found. She pressed herself against the chamber wall, hoping they wouldn't discover the hidden passage. The footsteps moved closer to the basement stairs, and Yen heard the distinctive squeak of the third step from the top, the same sound that announced her own descents into the basement. In moments, they would be down here, searching. The passage opening was too narrow for her to escape quickly, and there was nowhere else to hide. She pressed her hands against the symbols on the wall, desperately hoping for some kind of help or guidance. The stone grew warm under her touch, and she felt that strange energy building in her fingertips. The blueprints spread across her kitchen table told a story that made Yen's hands tremble. She'd spent 3 sleepless nights cross-referencing the architectural plans with the journal entries, and the pattern that emerged was impossible to ignore. Every modification Marcus Blackwood had made to the house over the decades corresponded with dates when people in town had simply vanished. The basement expansion in 1923, the strange room addition behind the kitchen in 1931, the sealed-off space beneath the main staircase in 1945. Each construction project marked another disappearance, another life that the town had quietly forgotten. Her phone buzzed against the scattered papers. Detective Morrison's name flashed on the screen. "We found something." His voice was grim when she answered. "Can you come down to the station?" 20 minutes later, Yen sat in a sterile interrogation room that smelled of burnt coffee and disinfectant. Morrison placed her evidence bag on the metal table between them. Inside was a tarnished silver locket, its chain broken. "Construction crew found this wedged behind a beam in your basement wall," Morrison explained. "There's an inscription." Yen leaned forward, her pregnant belly pressing against the table edge. Through the plastic she could make out delicate script. "For my beloved Sarah, may our love transcend all boundaries. M.B. Marcus Blackwood," she whispered. Morrison nodded. "We cross-referenced the name Sarah with missing persons reports from the 1920s. Sarah Chen, 23 years old, went missing in October 1923. She was engaged to the town banker's son, but apparently she'd been seen around your property several times before she disappeared." The room felt suddenly cold. Yen thought of the basement, of the way the walls seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat when she stood too close. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your house might be more than just the site of accidents, Mrs. Santos. We're getting a warrant to do a full excavation." That evening, Yen sat in her car outside the condemned house, unable to make herself go inside. The setting sun cast long shadows across the overgrown yard, and she swore she could see shapes moving behind the grimy windows. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her distress. Her phone rang. "Carlos, I've been thinking about what you told me," he said without preamble. "About the journal, the blueprints. I want to come home." "Carlos, no. It's not safe. I think—" She paused, watching a curtain flutter in an upstairs window despite there being no wind. "I think Marcus Blackwood was a killer. I think he buried them in the house." Silence stretched between them. Then Carlos spoke, his voice tight with worry. "Pack a bag. Come stay with Maria until this is resolved. Please. I can't just leave. This house, these people who died here, they're connected to our family somehow. I found our great-grandmother's name in one of the journal entries. She cleaned house for Blackwood in 1945, right before she supposedly moved away. But Carlos, what if she didn't move away? What if—" A loud crash from inside the house cut her off. Through the phone, Carlos was saying something urgent, but Yen's attention fixed on the front door, which now stood wide open. She was certain it had been closed when she arrived. "I have to go," she whispered into the phone. "Yen, don't you dare." She ended the call and stepped out of the car. Every instinct screamed at her to drive away, but something stronger pulled her toward the house. The baby had gone completely still, and an unnatural quiet settled over the property. The front hallway was darker than usual, shadows pooling in corners that shouldn't exist. Yen pulled out her phone's flashlight and followed the beam toward the basement door. It too stood open, revealing the wooden steps that disappeared into blackness below. She descended carefully, one hand on the rail, the other protecting her belly. The basement had changed since her last visit. The walls looked different somehow, older and more weathered. And there was a smell, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water. At the bottom of the stairs, her flashlight beam caught something that made her gasp. Fresh scratches covered the concrete floor in deliberate patterns, forming letters, then words. Help us. Find us. Remember us. Her phone's battery died abruptly, plunging her into complete darkness. But somehow, she could still see the words, glowing with a faint phosphorescent light. And now she could hear them too, whispers emanating from within the walls themselves, speaking in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. We've been waiting, the voices murmured in unison, waiting for someone who could see, someone who could free us. Yen backed toward the stairs, but her foot struck something solid. She looked down to see a wooden chest, ancient and carved with symbols that hurt her eyes to look at directly. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Open it, they pleaded. Set us free. Her hand moved toward the chest's iron latch almost of its own accord, drawn by a compulsion stronger than fear. The baby suddenly kicked hard, as if warning her to stop, but her fingers were already closing around the cold metal. The contractor's estimate sat on Yen's kitchen table like an accusation. $47,000 to make the house structurally sound, not counting the electrical work or plumbing. She traced her finger along the itemized list, each line item a small betrayal of her optimism. The foundation alone needs 12 grand, Marcus said, settling his coffee cup down with deliberate care. And that's assuming we don't find more rot once we start digging. Yen pressed her palm against her belly, feeling the subtle flutter of movement that had begun just days ago. The baby seemed restless lately, especially when she spent time in the house. There has to be another way. Honey, I know you love that place, but love doesn't fix structural damage. Marcus reached across the table, covering her hand with his. We could sell it as is, maybe break even after closing costs. She pulled her hand away, the rejection sharper than she'd intended. I'm not selling. Then what? We don't have $47,000 lying around. And with the baby coming... I know about the baby coming. The words emerged harsher than she meant them to. I'm carrying her. I think about her every second of every day. Marcus leaned back, hurt flickering across his features. I didn't mean... I found something yesterday. Yen stood, moving to the window that faced the direction of her house, though it wasn't visible from here. In the basement. There's a room I hadn't seen before. Yen. Marcus's voice carried a warning she'd been hearing more frequently. You promised you wouldn't go down there alone. The stairs are barely holding together. She turned to face him, noting how the morning light caught the worry lines that seemed deeper each day. I was careful. And I'm glad I went, because I found a desk, an old roll top with papers inside. What kind of papers? Correspondence. Letters between Eleanor Hartwell and someone named Thomas Morrison. They were intimate. And there were architectural drawings I'd never seen before, plans for modifications to the house that were never built. Marcus frowned. What kind of modifications? Secret passages, hidden rooms, storage spaces built into the walls. Yen moved back to the table, pulling out photocopies she'd made at the library. But that's not the most interesting part. Thomas Morrison wasn't just Eleanor's lover, he was a bank president. She watched understanding dawn on Marcus's face. You think there's something hidden in the house? I think Eleanor Hartwell had reasons for those modifications that went beyond romance. The letters mention safeguarding what matters most and ensuring the future. And Marcus, some of these letters are dated 1933, the Depression. Exactly. Banks were failing, people were desperate. What if Eleanor and Thomas hid something valuable, something they thought they'd come back for? Marcus studied the photocopied drawings, his architect's eye tracing the careful lines. These passages, They're ingenious, built into the existing structure so they wouldn't be obvious even during renovation. I want to explore them before we do any major work. Absolutely not. Marcus set the papers down firmly. Yen, you're 6 months pregnant. You're not crawling through century-old hidden passages in a house that's literally falling down. Then come with me. That's not the point. This is... He paused, running his hands through his hair. This is starting to feel obsessive. You're spending more time in that house than here. You're talking about it constantly. And now you want to go treasure hunting? The accusation stung because it carried a grain of truth she wasn't ready to acknowledge. I'm trying to save our investment. Are you? Or are you trying to save something else? Before she could answer, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Chen's office, and Yen's stomach immediately tightened. She'd had her routine appointment just 3 days ago. Mrs. Rodriguez, this is Sarah from Dr. Chen's office. The doctor would like you to come in this afternoon for a follow-up ultrasound. Is everything okay? She just wants to take another look at something from your last visit. Can you come in around 2? Yen agreed, her hand automatically moving to her belly. After hanging up, she found Marcus watching her with naked concern. Everything's probably fine, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Probably. She sat down heavily, the fight draining out of her. Marcus, what if I'm making a mistake? What if this house is just... What if I'm seeing things that aren't there? He moved to stand behind her chair, his hands settling on her shoulders. Then we'll figure it out together. But first, let's make sure everything's okay with the baby. Outside, clouds were gathering again, the same heavy grey that seemed to hover perpetually over her house. Yen closed her eyes, trying to distinguish between the flutter of her baby's movements and the strange certainty that had been growing inside her, alongside her pregnancy, the certainty that the house held answers she desperately needed to find. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows as Yen carefully descended into the basement, her hand trailing along the cool stone wall for support. The journal's revelations from the night before had left her sleepless, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Ilara's story was incomplete. There had to be more, something hidden in the depths of the house that would explain the strange occurrences and the pull she felt toward this place. Marcus had left early for a job site inspection, kissing her forehead and reminding her to take it easy. If only he knew she was about to explore the one part of the house they'd barely touched since moving in. The basement had always felt different, colder somehow, as if it held on to secrets the upper floors had long forgotten. Her flashlight beam swept across the stone foundation, revealing shelves lined with mason jars filled with mysterious preserved substances. Herbs, roots, and what looked like crystallized minerals caught the light like imprisoned stars. This wasn't just storage, it was a workshop, a laboratory of sorts, Ilara's sanctuary. Behind the shelves, Yen discovered something that made her breath catch. A section of the wall looked different, newer somehow, despite being made of the same stone. Running her fingers along the mortar, she found it crumbled away easily, as if it had been meant to be opened. With growing excitement and a flutter of nervousness from the baby, she began working at the loose stones. 20 minutes later, she'd created an opening large enough to squeeze through. The space beyond was small, more of a hidden alcove than a room, but what it contained made her heart race. Dozens of journals lined makeshift shelves, their leather bindings worn smooth by countless hands. But it was the table in the center that truly captured her attention. Spread across its surface was what appeared to be a detailed map of the property, but not as it existed now. This version showed the house in its original state, with additional structures that had long since vanished. Gardens were marked with symbols she didn't recognize, and lines connected various points around the property like some kind of mystical grid. At the center of it all, marked with a distinctive star, was the basement, exactly where she stood now. Yen carefully lifted one of the journals, this one bound in dark blue leather with silver clasps. As she opened it, a loose photograph fluttered to the floor. She bent awkwardly to retrieve it, her growing belly making the movement challenging. The image showed a woman who could have been her twin, the same dark hair, the same angular features, even the same determined set to her jaw. But the photograph was clearly old, the clothing unmistakably from the early 1900s. Her hands trembling, she turned the photograph over. In faded ink, someone had written, Elena Morrison, 1923. The bloodline continues. Elena Morrison, not Ilara, Elena. And Morrison had been Yen's grandmother's maiden name. The journal's pages revealed Elena's story, written in a hand that grew increasingly urgent as the entries progressed. She had been pregnant when she discovered the house's secrets, just as Yen was now. The property sat on what Elena called a convergence point, a place where natural energies gathered and could be channeled by those with the gift to perceive them. Elena wrote of visions that came with her pregnancy, of voices that called to her from the walls themselves. She described experiments with the plants in her garden, how certain combinations could heal, others could reveal hidden truths, and some could open doorways to possibilities that shouldn't exist. But with each entry, the tone grew darker, more desperate. The house feeds on intention, one entry read. Give it purpose, and it gives back power. But the price is always higher than expected. James thinks I've lost my mind, but I know what I've seen, what I've become. The child inside me glows with the same energy that runs through these walls. We are connected now, all three of us, past, present, and future. The final entries spoke of a choice Elena had to make. The house's power was growing stronger, drawn by her pregnancy and her bloodline's natural sensitivity to its energies. She could embrace it fully and risk losing herself to something beyond human understanding, or she could try to contain it, to create safeguards for those who might come after her. I have prepared the way, the last entry read. Hidden what needs hiding, protected what can be protected. If another of my blood finds this place, let her know that the choice is hers. The power is real, but so is the danger. Trust the house, but trust yourself more. The baby will be the key, they always are. Yen closed the journal, her mind reeling. Elena Morrison, her great-great-grandmother perhaps? The family resemblance was undeniable, and the timing fit with what little she knew of her family history. But more than that, Elena's experiences mirrored her own in ways that seemed impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The baby moved restlessly in her womb, and for a moment, Yen could swear she felt something else, a presence, warm and protective, surrounding them both like invisible arms. The cramped basement felt even smaller with three people hunched over the metal box. Yen's hands trembled as she worked the rusted latches, her pregnancy making the awkward position increasingly uncomfortable. Marcus held the flashlight steady, while Detective Rivera watched with the intense focus of someone who'd spent years chasing cold leads. There, Yen whispered, as the final latch gave way with a metallic groan. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived decades of basement dampness, lay a collection that made Rivera suck in her breath. Photographs, dozens of them, showing the house in its original glory. But these weren't family portraits or construction records. Jesus, Marcus breathed, leaning closer to examine the images by flashlight. The photographs documented something far more sinister. Young women, all bearing a striking resemblance to each other, and to Yen, posed stiffly in Victorian dress within the house's ornate rooms. But their eyes held a haunted quality that transcended the formal photography of the era. Look at the dates, Rivera said, pointing to the careful script on each photograph's back. 1897, 1898, 1899. They span. Beneath the photographs lay a leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. Yen opened it carefully, squinting at the faded ink in the dim light. The handwriting was precise, methodical, the work of someone documenting a systematic process. It's signed by Cornelius Blackwood, she read aloud, the original owner. As she read silently, her face grew pale. Marcus noticed her grip tightening on the journal's edges. What does it say? He was documenting bloodlines, family trees going back generations. Her voice caught. He was looking for something specific, a genetic trait that ran through certain families. Rivera took the journal, her police training kicking in as she scanned the entries. This reads like experimental notes. He was tracking women who exhibited what he called the sight, some kind of inherited ability to see the dead. Yen finished quietly. The basement seemed to grow colder. Above them, the house creaked and settled, as if responding to their discovery. "There's more," Rivera continued, flipping pages. He wasn't just documenting these women, he was bringing them here, under various pretenses. Marriage proposals, job opportunities, promises of inheritance. Marcus reached for one of the photographs, studying the face of a young woman who could have been Yen's twin. What happened to them? Rivera's expression darkened as she read further. According to this, he believed that death, specifically death within the house, would strengthen their connection to what he called the other side. He thought he could harness their abilities somehow. He was murdering them, Yen said, the words barely audible. Over 30 years, apparently. But then something went wrong. Rivera turned several pages, her flashlight beam dancing across increasingly frantic handwriting. The last entries? Listen to this. They refuse to rest. The girls grow stronger each night. I can hear them in the walls, feel them in the very foundation. What I thought would give me power over death has instead given death power over life itself. A sound from upstairs made them all freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the floor directly above them. "Someone's in the house," Marcus whispered. Rivera drew her weapon, motioning for them to stay back, but as they listened, the footsteps multiplied. First one set, then two, then what sounded like dozens of people moving through the rooms above. "That's not possible," Rivera said, but her voice lacked conviction. Yen clutched the journal tighter, feeling the baby kick restlessly inside her. "They know we found this. They know we understand what happened to them." The footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt oppressive. Then, from somewhere in the walls around them, came the sound of voices, whispered conversations in a language that might have been English, but was too distorted to comprehend. "We need to get out of here," Marcus said. But as they moved toward the basement stairs, the door at the top slammed shut with enough force to shake dust from the ceiling. Rivera tried the handle, throwing her weight against the door. "It's locked, or blocked." The whispering grew louder, seeming to come from every direction at once. In the beam of their flashlight, Yen could swear she saw shapes moving just beyond the circle of light, indistinct, forms that vanished when she tried to focus on them. "Cornelius's last entry," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "What else does it say?" Rivera fumbled with the journal pages. "He writes about trying to break the connection, to send them on, but every method failed. In the end, She paused, reading ahead. "He sealed himself in the basement, hoping to starve them of fresh victims. Did it work?" Rivera's silence was answer enough. Above them, the footsteps resumed, now accompanied by what sounded unmistakably like sobbing, the grief of women who had been denied justice for over a century. The blueprint spread across Yen's kitchen table told a story she wasn't prepared to hear. Her hands trembled as she traced the architectural lines with her finger, following the precise measurements that revealed hidden chambers throughout the house, chambers that shouldn't exist according to any modern building code or historical record. "Look at this," she whispered to Marcus, who leaned over her shoulder, his breath warm against her neck. "These aren't storage spaces or utility rooms. They're interconnected, almost like a network," Marcus finished, his voice tight with unease. What were they hiding down there? Yen's pregnancy had been making her more sensitive to the house's strange energy, and now she understood why. The building itself was designed as some kind of conductor, channeling something through its walls and foundations. The nausea that had been plaguing her wasn't morning sickness. It was the house responding to the life growing inside her. The revelation hit her like ice water. She pushed back from the table, nearly knocking over her chair. "Marcus, I think we need to leave. Tonight." Before he could respond, a soft knocking echoed from somewhere deep within the house, not at the front door or back entrance, but from below, as if someone were trapped in the basement and trying to signal for help. Marcus grabbed the flashlight they'd been keeping handy since the electrical issues started. "Stay here." "Absolutely not." Yen clutched his arm. "We go together, or we don't go at all." They descended the basement stairs slowly, each creak of the old wood seeming unnaturally loud in the darkness. The knocking had stopped, replaced by a subtle humming that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Yen's architectural training kicked in as she examined the foundation with new eyes, seeing now what she had missed before. "These aren't load-bearing walls," she murmured, running her hands along the stone. "They're decorative, or functional for something else entirely." Marcus played the flashlight beam across the far corner where Yen had found the first hidden compartment. Now, with the blueprints fresh in her memory, she could see the subtle differences in the masonry that indicated other concealed spaces. "Here," she said, pressing against a section of wall that looked identical to the rest but felt slightly different under pressure. A panel slid sideways with surprising smoothness, revealing a narrow passage that disappeared into darkness. The air that rushed out carried scents of old wood, metal, and something else, something organic and unsettling. Marcus directed the flashlight into the opening, illuminating rough-hewn walls and what appeared to be machinery from another era. "What is that?" Yen breathed, staring at the intricate brass and copper contraption that filled the hidden chamber. Gears and pulleys connected to pipes that ran up into the ceiling, presumably through the walls of the house above. Marcus stepped into the passage, despite Yen's sharp intake of breath. "It's some kind of pump system. But for what?" As if in answer to his question, the machinery suddenly groaned to life. The gears began turning with deliberate precision, and a low thrumming filled the air. Yen felt it in her bones, in her blood, and most disturbingly, in her belly where their unborn child was growing. "Get out of there!" she called to Marcus, but he was transfixed by what he was seeing deeper in the chamber. "Yen, there are records here, journals, and they're recent, some dated just last year." Against every instinct screaming at her to flee, Yen squeezed through the opening. The hidden chamber was larger than it had appeared from outside, extending well beyond the footprint of the house itself. Shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes and glass containers holding substances she couldn't identify. Marcus had found a desk covered in papers and opened books. By flashlight, they read entries written in different hands across different time periods, all documenting the same phenomenon. Families drawn to the house, mothers giving birth to children with unusual abilities, and something called the awakening that occurred every few decades. "Look at this," Marcus pointed to a recent entry. "Dr. Elizabeth Thorne, 1847. Sarah Martinez, 1923. Catherine Walsh, 1967. Jennifer Liu, 2001. He looked up at Yen, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. "They're all women who bought this house while pregnant." Yen's hands instinctively went to her belly as she read over his shoulder. Each entry detailed pregnancies that progressed unusually fast, children born with extraordinary capabilities, and families whose lives were forever changed, not always for the better. The machinery around them continued its rhythmic operation, and Yen realized with growing horror that it was responding to her presence, to the life she carried. The house hadn't been abandoned and condemned by accident. It had been waiting. "We have to destroy this," she said, backing toward the passage opening. "All of it." But as they turned to leave, the panels slid shut with a decisive click, trapping them in the chamber with the mechanical heartbeat of something that had been hungry for far too long. The basement felt different now, charged with an energy that made Yen's skin prickle. She descended the creaking stairs with Marcus close behind, both of them carrying flashlights that cut weak paths through the darkness. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic that reminded her uncomfortably of blood. "The wall here," Yen whispered, running her hand along the rough stone. "It's not original construction. Look at the mortar." Marcus leaned closer, his light revealing the telltale signs of newer masonry work. The stones were fitted differently, the pointing cleaner despite decades of age. Someone sealed something up down here. Yen's pulse quickened. Ever since finding Eleanor's journal 3 days ago, she'd been consumed by the architect's final entry. The foundation holds more than stones. What we buried must stay buried, but I fear the children will not understand. The bloodline demands its due. We need to break through, she said, surprising herself with her determination. Yen, maybe we should. Oh. Her voice carried a firmness that brooked no argument. The baby stirred within her, as if responding to her resolve. I'm tired of half-answers and cryptic warnings. If this house is going to be our home, I need to know what we're dealing with. Marcus studied her face in the flashlight's glow, then nodded slowly. I'll get the sledgehammer from upstairs. While he was gone, Yen remained in the basement, her light trained on the suspicious wall. The silence pressed against her eardrums, broken only by the distant settling of old wood. She pressed her palm flat against the stones, and for a moment she could have sworn she felt something pulse back, a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat. The sensation made her jerk her hand away, just as Marcus returned with the tools. You felt it too, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. Whatever lay behind this wall had been waiting for decades, perhaps longer. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt an odd sense of coming home. Marcus raised the sledgehammer. Last chance to change your mind. Do it. The first blow sent vibrations through the floor. The second cracked the mortar. By the fifth strike, stones began to shift, and a gap appeared that released a rush of stale air so intense it made them both stagger backward. The smell that emerged was ancient, not decay but preservation, like a tomb that had been sealed with purpose rather than neglect. Marcus widened the hole until it was large enough for them to squeeze through. Yen went first, driven by a compulsion she couldn't name. Her flashlight beam revealed a small chamber, perhaps 8 feet square, with walls lined in the same stone as the foundation above. But it was what occupied the center of the space that stole her breath. A wooden chest sat on a raised platform of stone, its surface carved with symbols that seemed to shift in the dancing light. Around it, the floor was inlaid with what looked like a compass rose, but instead of cardinal directions, the points were marked with symbols she didn't recognize. Jesus, Marcus breathed behind her. How old do you think this is? Yen approached the chest slowly, her architect's eye cataloguing details. The wood was dark with age but showed no signs of rot. The iron hinges, though tarnished, appeared solid. Most unsettling were the symbols carved deep into the lid. They matched perfectly with those she'd seen scattered throughout Eleanor's journal. The previous owners weren't just hiding family secrets, she murmured. They were preserving something. Her hands trembled as she reached for the lid. The moment her fingers touched the wood, images flashed through her mind, not her own memories, but older ones. Women in long skirts walking these same basement stairs, midnight gatherings around this very chest, and through it all, the sensation of power flowing like water through generations. The lid opened without resistance. Inside, nested in faded velvet, lay objects that defied easy explanation. A leather-bound ledger with pages yellowed by time, glass vials filled with substances that caught their flashlight beams and seemed to glow from within, and beneath it all, a collection of documents tied with ribbon, property deeds, birth certificates, and what appeared to be detailed architectural drawings of not just this house, but others scattered throughout the city. Yen lifted the ledger with reverent care. The first page bore an inscription in flowing script for those who carry the gift forward. May they understand what others fear. As she read, Marcus explored the chamber's perimeter. Yen, he called softly, look at this. She joined him at the far wall, where he'd discovered another inscription carved directly into the stone. This one was larger, more deliberate, and written in multiple languages, English, Latin, and symbols that predated both. But it was the English portion that made her blood run cold. The house chooses its own. What is freely given cannot be taken. What is bound by blood endures beyond death. The baby kicked hard and Yen gasped, one hand flying to her stomach. In that moment she understood with absolute clarity that they had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The basement floor cracked beneath Yen's feet as she descended into darkness, her flashlight beam dancing across stone walls that predated the house above. Marcus's warnings echoed in her mind, but the pull she felt toward whatever lay hidden below was stronger than fear. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly, where the baby had been unusually active all morning, as if responding to the same mysterious energy that drew her downward. The air grew colder with each step, carrying scents of earth and something else, something metallic and ancient. Her architect's eye noted the craftsmanship of the stonework, the precise joints that had held for over a century despite the house's decay above. This wasn't just a basement, it was a foundation built with purpose, with reverence. At the bottom of the stairs, her flashlight revealed a circular chamber she hadn't expected, the walls curved in perfect symmetry, lined with niches that held objects wrapped in oiled cloth. In the center of the room stood a pedestal supporting what appeared to be an ornate wooden box, its surface carved with the same symbols she'd found throughout the house. Yen approached slowly, her footsteps echoing in the confined space. The baby kicked hard, making her gasp and steady herself against the cold stone. As her hand touched the wall, warmth spread through the rock, and the symbols began to glow with that familiar golden light. "The heart chamber," she whispered, understanding flooding through her. This was where it all began, where Elias Whitmore had hidden the most important secrets of his work. The wooden box called to her, but first she examined the niches. Each contained artifacts wrapped with care, journals bound in leather, strange instruments made of metals she couldn't identify, and vials filled with crystalline powders that sparkled in her flashlight beam. One niche held a collection of daguerreotype photographs, showing people she didn't recognize, their faces bearing the same intense expression she'd seen in Elias's portrait. She unwrapped one of the journals and opened it carefully. The pages were filled with Elias's handwriting, but these entries were different from the ones she'd found upstairs. These were instructions, formulas, warnings written in a hand that grew increasingly frantic. "The convergence approaches," one entry read. "The bloodline must be preserved. The child will be the key, but the choice will be theirs alone. I have seen what comes if the power is rejected and what comes if it is embraced. Both paths lead through darkness, but only one leads to light." Her hands trembling, Yen turned the pages, finding detailed diagrams of the house's layout, with notations about energy flows, ley lines, and what Elias called anchor points. The house wasn't just built on a place of power, it was designed to harness and focus that power, to prepare for something he called the awakening. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Yen doubled over with sudden pain. When she straightened, every symbol on the walls was blazing with golden light, and she could hear something, voices, whispers, a sound like singing coming from the stones themselves. She turned to the central pedestal, knowing she had no choice but to open the box. As her fingers touched the carved lid, images flooded her mind. Elias standing in this very chamber, his wife beside him, both of them placing their hands on a glowing stone. Children through the generations, each faced with the same choice. The power growing stronger, waiting, becoming something that could either heal or destroy. Inside the box lay a crystal unlike anything she'd ever seen. It pulsed within a light, warm to the touch, and the moment her fingers made contact, she understood everything. The Whitmore family hadn't just been keepers of secrets. They were guardians of a power that could reshape reality itself. Each generation, one child was chosen to carry the responsibility forward. The power could heal the sick, restore the broken, even bring life where there was none. But it demanded sacrifice, and it came with dangers that had driven some guardians to madness. Yen lifted the crystal, feeling its weight, its warmth, its terrible potential. The baby inside her seemed to respond to its energy, moving in ways that felt almost like recognition. She was the next guardian, and her unborn child would inherit the choice after her. But as the crystal's light filled the chamber, she heard footsteps on the stairs above. Marcus's voice called out, tight with worry and something else, fear that sounded like knowledge. "Yen, don't touch anything down there. You don't understand what you're dealing with." His voice carried an urgency that made her freeze. How did he know what she was doing? How did he know about the basement at all? The crystal's light flickered as doubt crept into her mind. She thought about Marcus's convenient appearance in her life, his knowledge of the house, his attempts to guide her away from certain discoveries. Had he been watching her all along? Footsteps echoed closer, and Yen realized she had to make a choice. Trust Marcus and surrender the crystal, or embrace the power that called to her blood and face whatever consequences came with it. The awakening had begun, and there was no turning back. The basement felt different now, charged with an energy that made Yen's skin prickle as she descended the creaking stairs. Marcus followed close behind, his flashlight beam dancing across walls that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. The symbols she'd discovered weeks ago glowed faintly in the darkness, more visible now than they'd ever been before. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus whispered, though his voice seemed to echo unnaturally in the confined space. Yen pressed her hand to her rounded belly, feeling the baby's urgent kicks. Ever since finding the final journal entry hidden behind the loose brick, she'd felt an overwhelming compulsion to return here. The previous owner's words haunted her. The house chooses its keeper, and the keeper must choose what matters most. "I have to understand what's happening to us," she replied, approaching the altar-like stone structure in the center of the room. "Every renovation I've made, every change to this house, it's all been leading to this moment." The photographs spread across her kitchen table upstairs told an impossible story. Images of previous owners spanning decades, all of them transformed in ways that defied explanation. The woman from the 1920s who'd supposedly gained the ability to see the future. The man from the 1950s whose architectural designs had revolutionized the city despite having no formal training. The family from the 1980s whose sick daughter had miraculously recovered from a terminal illness. All of them had paid a price. Marcus aimed his light at the symbols carved deep into the stone. "These markings, they're not from any culture I recognize. It's like they're older than anything that should exist in this region." Yen ran her fingers along the grooves, feeling warmth emanating from within the stone. "The house isn't just old, Marcus. It's ancient, built on something that was here long before the first settlers arrived." She paused, remembering the surveyor's confused expression when he'd tried to date the foundation. "The land records only go back so far, but the basement, this goes deeper." A sudden pain shot through her abdomen, causing her to gasp and lean against the stone surface. The moment her palm made full contact, the symbols blazed with brilliant light, illuminating the entire basement in ethereal blue radiance. "Yen!" Marcus rushed to her side but stopped short as the walls around them began to change. The cramped basement expanded, revealing a vast underground chamber that stretched far beyond what should have been possible given the house's footprint. Ancient pillars supported a ceiling that disappeared into shadow, and the air hummed with power that made their teeth ache. "This is what I've been seeing in my dreams," Yen whispered, her voice filled with wonder and terror. "The house showing me its true nature." In the center of the expanded space, the stone altar had transformed into an elaborate dais surrounded by intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move of their own accord. And rising from the patterns, translucent figures began to materialize, the spirits of every previous owner who'd made the ultimate bargain. "Welcome, architect," spoke a woman in 1920s dress, her voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "You've proven yourself worthy. The house has been preparing for you." "Preparing for what?" Yen demanded, though part of her already knew the answer. "The restoration nears completion," replied a man in colonial-era clothing, "but the final transformation requires a conscious choice. The house can give you everything you've ever dreamed of. Success beyond measure, a healthy child, a family legacy that will endure for generations." Marcus stepped protectively in front of Yen. "What's the catch? What does it cost?" The spirits exchanged glances before the woman spoke again. "The house must be fed. It requires life force to maintain its gifts. Usually it takes gradually from the keeper over many years, but sometimes," she gestured to a smaller figure, "a child from the Victorian era, it demands immediate payment. The baby." Yen breathed, understanding flooding through her. "It wants my baby." "Not to harm," the colonial man assured her quickly. "To transform. Your child would become something more than human, a guardian bound to this place for eternity. In exchange, your family line would be blessed with prosperity and power for 7 generations. The baby kicked violently, as if responding to the proposal. Yen felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized the true nature of the choice before her. Everything she'd worked for, every dream she'd harbored about providing for her family, could be hers. But at a cost that seemed unthinkable. "There has to be another way," Marcus said firmly. "Some other arrangement." The spirits began to fade, their voices growing distant. "The house has waited long enough. Choose wisely, architect. Dawn approaches, and with it, the final hour of decision." As the basement returned to its normal dimensions, Yen collapsed to her knees, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what lay ahead. The morning sun cast long shadows through the cracked windows as Yen stood in what had once been the house's grand parlor, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. The baby kicked, as if sensing the tension that filled the air like smoke. In her other hand, she clutched the final letter from the hidden correspondence she'd discovered behind the false wall, the one that explained everything. Marcus paced behind her, his footsteps echoing off the bare floorboards. "You can't seriously be considering this," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "After everything we've learned, after what happened to the Blackwood family, you want to complete the ritual?" Yen turned the yellowed paper over in her fingers, feeling the weight of generations pressing down upon her shoulders. The letter, written in Eleanor Blackwood's careful script just days before her mysterious disappearance, contained the final piece of the puzzle that had consumed Yen's life for months. The house wasn't just holding secrets. It was holding a destiny that had been waiting over a century to unfold. "The foundation isn't just cracking because of age," she said quietly, her architect's eye taking in the structural damage with new understanding. "It's responding to the incompletion. Every tremor, every shift, the house is literally tearing itself apart because the work Eleanor started was never finished." Dr. Reeves emerged from the basement, dust covering his clothes and concern etched deep in his weathered features. In his hands he carried the ornate wooden box they'd discovered buried beneath the collapsed section of the cellar floor. "The artifacts are all here," he confirmed, setting the box carefully on the makeshift table they'd constructed from sawhorses and plywood. Every piece Eleanor described in her notes. The box contained objects that defied easy categorization. Carved stones that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, metal instruments whose purpose became clear only when viewed through the lens of Eleanor's meticulous research, and a leather-bound journal filled with diagrams that bridged the gap between architecture and something far more ancient. "She was trying to create something unprecedented," Yen continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "A structure that could channel and amplify the natural energies of this land, transform them into something beneficial rather than destructive. The Blackwoods didn't disappear because they were victims. They became something more." Marcus stopped pacing and stared at her. "Listen to yourself, Yen. You're talking about transformation like it's a good thing. But what if Eleanor was wrong? What if what happened to her family wasn't transcendence but tragedy?" A sharp crack from the ceiling above them punctuated his words, sending a shower of plaster dust raining down. The house was running out of time, and Yen knew that her decision would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of the child growing within her. "The geological surveys all confirm it," Dr. Reeves said reluctantly. "The ground instability is increasing exponentially. If the foundation continues to deteriorate at this rate, the house will collapse completely within days. But more concerning is what my colleagues at the university have discovered about the land itself. He pulled out a folder thick with technical reports and maps. The energy readings we've been taking aren't just anomalous, they're building towards something significant. The ley lines that converge beneath this property are becoming increasingly active. Whether we complete Eleanor's work or not, something is going to happen here. Yen felt the baby kick again, more insistently this time, and she pressed her hand against her side. In that moment, she could almost swear she felt something else. A presence, warm and reassuring, as if Eleanor herself were offering guidance across the decades. "The birth," she said suddenly, the realization hitting her with crystalline clarity. That's why the timing matters. Eleanor wasn't just pregnant when she began this work. The pregnancy was part of it. New life, new possibility, the potential for transformation. Marcus's face went pale. "Yen, no. You're talking about using our child as part of some century-old experiment. I won't let you risk—" "I'm not risking anything," she interrupted, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even her. "I'm completing something that should have been finished long ago. Look around you, Marcus. Really look." She gestured to the walls, where the structural damage she'd first attributed to age and neglect now revealed itself as something else entirely. The cracks formed patterns, geometric designs that corresponded exactly to Eleanor's architectural plans. The house wasn't falling apart randomly. It was reshaping itself, trying to become what it had always been meant to be. "One way or another, this ends tonight," Yen said, picking up the first of the carved stones from Eleanor's collection. "The only question is whether we guide the transformation or let it happen without us." Outside, storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, and the first drops of rain began to fall on the condemned house that held the power to change everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the restored Victorian house as Yen stood in the nursery doorway, one hand resting on her rounded belly. 6 months had passed since she'd uncovered the truth about Eleanor Blackwood's journal and the dark legacy that had claimed so many lives. The house that had once threatened to consume her now felt like home, a real home, perhaps for the first time in her life. Marcus appeared beside her, carrying a steaming cup of tea. "The contractor says the final inspection should be completed by next week," he said softly. "Hard to believe this is the same place you bought for pocket change." Yen smiled, accepting the warmth of both the tea and his presence. The transformation had been remarkable, but it went far deeper than the restored crown molding and polished hardwood floors. The very atmosphere of the house had changed once she'd made her choice, once she'd decided to break the cycle rather than perpetuate it. "I keep thinking about Eleanor," she said, running her fingers along the freshly painted windowsill. "How different things might have been if she'd had someone to help her make a different choice." The journal entries had revealed everything. How Eleanor Blackwood, an architect like Yen, had purchased the house in 1924 during her own pregnancy. How she'd discovered the same supernatural influence that Yen had encountered, the house's ability to grant architectural visions of impossible beauty in exchange for something precious. For Eleanor, it had been her unborn child. For the others who'd lived here since, it had been their sanity, their families, their lives. But Yen had found another way. The sound of footsteps on the front porch interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she saw Dr. Sarah Chen approaching with a large manila envelope in her hands. Since helping Yen research the house's history, Sarah had become more than just the local historian. She'd become a trusted friend. "The final pieces," Sarah announced when Yen opened the door, holding up the envelope. "I found the missing records about Eleanor's architectural firm. You're going to want to see this." They gathered around the kitchen table, the same table where Yen had first spread out Eleanor's journal pages. Sarah carefully withdrew a collection of blueprints and documents, their edges yellowed with age. "Eleanor Blackwood didn't just live in this house," Sarah explained, unfolding the largest blueprint. "She designed it. And not just the renovations, the entire original structure. She built this place from the ground up." Yen studied the intricate drawings, recognizing the same innovative techniques she'd used in her own recent projects. The same impossible geometries that had made her award-winning designs so revolutionary. She was influenced by the same force, Yen whispered. But she tried to contain it, didn't she? Look at this. Sarah pointed to a series of detailed annotations in Eleanor's handwriting. She documented everything. The way the house seemed to inspire her designs, how her architectural vision expanded beyond normal human capability, but also how it demanded payment. Marcus leaned closer, studying the notes. She was trying to create a prison for it. A beautiful one, Yen corrected, understanding flooding through her. She couldn't destroy the influence, so she designed a space that would contain it while still allowing its creative power to exist. The house isn't cursed, it's a containment system. Sarah nodded. And when you chose to restore rather than demolish, when you broke the cycle of victims, you completed her work. The baby stirred in Yen's womb, and she felt a familiar flutter of movement. Not the unnatural stirring she'd experienced during those dark months, but the healthy motion of new life. Her choice to refuse the house's dark bargain, to find another way to channel its architectural influence, had saved more than just her child. It had freed everyone who might have lived here in the future. "There's something else," Sarah said, withdrawing a final document. Eleanor's last will and testament. She left instructions for what should happen if someone ever succeeded in completing her work. The document was brief but clear. Eleanor had established a trust held by the city that would grant full ownership of the house to anyone who could prove they had broken the chain of shadow and restored the light. The $256 Yen had paid hadn't been for the house itself, it had been the processing fee for the trust transfer. She knew, Yen breathed. Somehow, she knew that someday another architect would come, someone who would make the right choice. Marcus wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "So what happens now?" Yen looked around the kitchen, then toward the nursery where their child would soon sleep safely. The house still hummed with creative energy. She could feel it in her bones, inspiring new designs, new possibilities. But it was clean energy now, no longer demanding terrible sacrifices. "Now we live," she said simply. "We raise our daughter here, and maybe someday I'll leave instructions of my own just in case." She paused, feeling the baby move again. "Some gifts are too powerful to destroy, but they don't have to be curses. Eleanor showed us that." The afternoon light streamed through the windows, illuminating the space that had finally become what Eleanor Blackwood had always intended. Not a trap, but a sanctuary for impossible dreams made real.